There was a man who lived a quiet life on the same piece of land his family had owned for more than 70 years. He wasn't rich and he didn't live in a fancy house, but the place meant everything to him. His parents had worked the soil, built the old farmhouse with their own hands, and raised their children there. Every corner of that land held a memory: the tall oak tree where he learned to climb, the small pond where his mother used to wash clothes, the fence his father painted every summer. To outsiders, it was just a few acres of land outside a growing town, but to him it was home. He woke up before sunrise every morning, fed his chickens, checked the crops, and fixed whatever was broken. His life was simple, but it was peaceful. Then one year, everything around him began to change. The quiet road that led to his farm started to get busier. New houses began popping up where old fields used to be. Big trucks rumbled down the road, bringing in cement, steel, and workers. The once silent countryside was turning into a busy development zone. One morning, as he sat on his porch sipping tea, a sleek car pulled up near his gate. A man in a suit stepped out holding a folder. He had that polite smile that always hides something. He introduced himself as a representative from a construction company. They were planning to build a modern housing community nearby, he said. Then, as if it was a small detail, he mentioned that they were interested in buying his land. The man listened quietly, his eyes steady. When the offer was made, a number that would make many people say yes without a second thought, he simply shook his head. He told the visitor, "This land isn't for sale." The man in the suit smiled again, trying to sound friendly. "I understand," he said. "But if you change your mind, call us. We're offering a fair price." Then he left a business card and drove away. That was the first visit. Others came later, some polite, some pushy. Each time the farmer gave the same answer. No amount of money could replace the ground where his parents were buried and where his memories lived. After a few months, the visits stopped. For a while he thought they had moved on, but then new signs appeared near his property, metal stakes and flags marking the ground. He didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just surveying for nearby work. But soon the machines came. One afternoon, while he was tending his field, he heard the loud growl of an engine. When he looked up, he saw a bulldozer rolling near his fence line, followed by workers carrying blueprints. They were digging on his side. He rushed over and waved for them to stop. The workers looked confused. One of them shouted that they were following plans approved by the city. The man's heart sank. "This is my land," he said firmly. "You're digging on my property." The foreman checked his documents and said, "Sir, according to our records, this section belongs to Ridgeview Construction. You might want to talk to the city if there's a problem." Then he turned back to his crew and told them to keep working. For the first time in his life, the man felt powerless. He went straight to the town office, carrying the old papers that showed his family's ownership. The clerk at the desk looked nervous, flipping through files, then told him that the property lines had been updated in recent plans. The new development's map included a strip of his land. He demanded to know how that happened, but no one had clear answers. They told him to come back later, to fill out forms, to speak to different departments. Days turned into weeks, and every visit felt like running into a wall. The officials avoided direct answers. Some even hinted that it was a done deal. Back at home, the noise of construction grew louder each day. Trucks moved past his farmhouse. Dust covered his crops. He watched helplessly as the edge of his field was torn apart. At night, he sat by the window staring out at the dark land. He thought about his father, how hard he had worked to keep this place. He remembered the stories his mother told about how they struggled to buy this land when they had almost nothing. The thought of losing it to greedy people made his chest ache. Still, he refused to give up. He started keeping records, photos, videos, every letter and document he could find. He talked to neighbors who were also being pressured to sell, and slowly a pattern began to appear. The company seemed to be taking over land one piece at a time, using loopholes, confusion, and pressure. One evening, an old friend stopped by, a retired surveyor who knew the area well. After hearing what had happened, he offered to take a look at the boundaries himself. Together, they walked the property lines, checking the old markers buried under the soil. The friend confirmed what the man already knew. The new construction had crossed onto his land. That line was never moved, the friend said quietly. "They're building where they shouldn't." That night, the farmer sat at his kitchen table with a small lamp lighting the old map of his property. He traced the lines with his finger, the same lines his father once showed him as a boy, anger mixed with sadness. He didn't have the money to hire expensive lawyers, but he also knew one thing. He wouldn't be bullied into giving up what belonged to him. The next morning, he called a few people he knew, local reporters, a community group, and a small law firm in town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. If he couldn't fight with power, he would fight with truth. As the sun rose over the half-dug field, he stood by the fence watching the workers move. He didn't shout or wave his fists. He just stood there, calm but determined, as if telling the world that no matter how big their machines were, they couldn't break his spirit. He didn't know how far this fight would go or what it would cost him. But he knew one thing, that piece of land was more than soil. It was the story of his life, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that story away. The morning after the machines crossed his fence line, the man woke up with a heavy heart but a clear mind. He knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a fight for what was right. The sound of engines and hammers filled the air outside, but inside his kitchen, it was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. He sat with a notebook open, writing down everything that had happened so far, the dates, the names, the people he'd spoken to, even the color of the trucks that came onto his land. It might not seem important to others, but he wanted every small detail on record. Deep down, he knew that truth only matters when it's written down. That afternoon, he went to the town office again. The receptionist gave him the same polite smile as always, but there was a hint of discomfort in her eyes this time. When he asked to see the records again, she hesitated before finally handing him a folder. Inside were documents with maps and signatures he didn't recognize. The new boundaries showed part of his field belonging to Ridgeview Construction. "How can this be?" he asked. "These borders were never changed." The woman looked around nervously and said, "Sir, this came from the county registrar. It's all legal on paper." He flipped through the pages. The signatures looked official, the stamps real. But something felt off. His father's name, which should have been on the original deeds witnessed, was missing. The file mentioned a transfer from decades ago that never happened. Someone had altered the old maps, maybe by accident, maybe on purpose. Either way, it was wrong. When he left the office, he stopped outside for a long moment, staring at the paper in his hands. He felt the weight of it, not just the paper itself, but what it meant. Someone had played with his history, changing the truth to fit their plan. Back home, the sound of drilling echoed from the edge of the property. Dust floated through the air like a storm cloud. He stood there watching his land get ripped apart, and something inside him hardened. He wasn't just protecting dirt anymore. He was protecting his father's name, his family's story, everything that defined who he was. That evening, he made calls to every person he thought might help. Most didn't answer. Some said they were sorry but couldn't get involved. Just when he was about to give up, a young man called him back, a lawyer who had heard about the situation from a friend. The lawyer asked to meet him and see the papers in person. They met at a small cafe in town the next day. The lawyer listened carefully while the man explained everything. When he saw the documents, he frowned. "These papers look altered," he said quietly. "There's no record of this transfer in the county archives. Someone must have slipped this through years ago." The lawyer explained that Ridgeview Construction had a long history of pushing boundaries, not just on land but in business too. They often used complicated paperwork and loopholes to get what they wanted. "They count on people giving up," he said. "But you haven't." That gave the man a spark of hope. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. The lawyer agreed to help him, even though the case looked difficult. Together they began gathering proof. Old maps, family photos, tax receipts, and even letters from the man's father that mentioned the original boundaries. Each piece of evidence told part of the truth. Over the next few weeks, they uncovered something shocking. Ridgeview had been quietly working with a few city officials to adjust the zoning map. The construction company had paid extra fees to rush approvals and had used those approvals to stretch their development area. In that process, a few small landowners lost parts of their property without even realizing it. The man's land happened to be one of them. When he learned this, he felt both anger and sadness. He couldn't believe people could take what wasn't theirs and call it business. But instead of shouting or acting out of anger, he decided to be patient and careful. He knew the truth always comes out. It just takes time. The lawyer advised him to stay calm and let them handle the paperwork quietly. "If we make noise too soon," the lawyer said, "they'll find a way to cover it up." So they kept working in silence, collecting every record that proved the land was his. Meanwhile, the construction continued. Some nights the lights from the site shone bright through his windows. He could hear the sound of engines even after midnight. It was hard to sleep knowing that strangers were cutting into the land he grew up on. But each time he felt hopeless, he reminded himself why he was fighting. One day he walked to the far end of his field and noticed something unusual: a small wooden post, half buried under weeds. When he brushed off the dirt, he saw faint writing on it, his father's initials and the year it was placed. It was one of the original boundary markers from decades ago. He smiled softly and whispered, "You were right, Dad. The line never moved." He took a picture of the marker and sent it to the lawyer. That small piece of wood turned out to be an important clue. With it, they could prove the true border of his property. The lawyer filed an official complaint with the court, asking for a full review of the land records. News started spreading around town about what was happening. Some people came by to offer support, others just to see if the story was true. A few even admitted that Ridgeview had tried to buy their land too, using the same tricks and pressure. Slowly, more people began to stand beside him. One afternoon, a group of workers from the construction site came over during their lunch break. They told him quietly that they didn't like what was happening either. They said they were just following orders, but they respected him for not giving up. Hearing that meant more to him than anything. Weeks turned into months, and the fight was far from over. But something had changed. The man wasn't just defending his land anymore, he was uncovering something bigger. He was standing up against a system that thought one man couldn't make a difference. Every night he'd walk the fence line with a flashlight, checking the ground, making sure nothing else had been taken. The hum of machines had become part of his life now, but so had his quiet determination. He didn't know what the court would decide. He didn't know how powerful the people behind Ridgeview really were. But he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't back down. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. He looked at his field, now half torn and dusty, and whispered to himself, "They think they can build over me. Let's see how far they can go." He didn't realize it yet, but this was only the beginning. What started as a fight for his land was slowly turning into something much bigger, a battle that would soon flip everything upside down. The months passed slowly, and each day felt like a test of patience. The man's land still stood half-dug and dusty, but he didn't lose hope. The court process was moving forward, and his lawyer was doing all he could to prove the truth. Still, the waiting was hard. Every morning when he looked out his window and saw the unfinished construction at the edge of his field, a quiet anger stirred in him. But in that anger, something else began to grow: curiosity. He wanted to know more about Ridgeview Construction, the company that had caused all this trouble. Who owned it? How big was it? And why were they so determined to take his land when they already had so much? One afternoon, while waiting for a meeting with his lawyer, he stopped by the public library in town. He sat in front of an old computer and began searching through local business records. What he found surprised him. Ridgeview Construction wasn't as stable as everyone thought. They had many projects across the region, but most of them were delayed or over budget. There were even complaints from suppliers who hadn't been paid on time. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became. Ridgeview was struggling. They had borrowed large sums from banks to keep building, hoping that their next big project would save them. But the market was slowing down and their debts were piling up. The company that had seemed untouchable was actually standing on shaky ground. He printed out a few articles and brought them to his lawyer. The lawyer studied them carefully. "You might be onto something here," he said. "If they're in financial trouble, they'll be desperate to push through any project they can. That's probably why they went after your land so aggressively." For the first time, the man felt like the power balance was shifting, even just a little. Ridgeview had money, influence, and connections, but they also had weaknesses. And now he knew where to look. Over the next few weeks, he started attending local town meetings where Ridgeview representatives often showed up. He sat quietly in the back, listening to their presentations. They spoke confidently about new developments and bright futures, but behind the polished words he could see the cracks. There were delays, complaints, and growing tension between the company and the city. After one meeting, he overheard two contractors talking outside. One of them said, "Ridgeview's running out of time. If they don't get that new loan approved, they're finished." Those words stayed in his mind. He went home and thought about them all night. He had spent months defending his land, always reacting to what the company did. But now, for the first time, he wondered what would happen if he stopped reacting and started planning. A few days later, the lawyer called him with an update. "The court accepted our evidence," he said. "They're reviewing the property lines. It's going to take some time, but the case looks strong." The man thanked him and hung up. Then he stepped outside, looking at his field. The sun was setting and the air was filled with the sound of crickets. It was peaceful for a moment, but inside him something was changing. He wasn't just fighting to get his land back anymore. He wanted to make sure that no one else in town would have to go through what he did. He started talking to other locals, small business owners, farmers, workers who had been pushed aside by big companies. Many of them had stories just like his. They had been pressured to sell, ignored by officials, and made to feel powerless. Listening to them gave him strength. He realized that what happened to him was part of a much bigger picture. One evening, a former Ridgeview employee reached out to him. The man didn't know him personally, but the worker said he had heard about the case. They met at a quiet diner, and over coffee, the worker shared what he knew. "Ridgeview isn't what it used to be," he said. "They've been cutting corners, losing contracts, and laying off good people. The boss is desperate to keep the company alive. If someone had enough patience and money, they could probably buy it soon." The man almost laughed at the idea. Him, buying the company that tried to steal his land. It sounded impossible, but the thought stayed in his mind long after the conversation ended. He went home and couldn't sleep. All night he thought about what that worker said. Ridgeview was powerful once, but now they were crumbling. What if the tables could really turn? What if, instead of just winning in court, he could take something even bigger from them? Their control. From that night on, his curiosity turned into quiet research. He started learning how business auctions worked. He read about how failing companies were sold when they went bankrupt. The more he learned, the more it made sense. Ridgeview had built their empire by stepping on others. Now their own mistakes were catching up to them. Weeks later, rumors began spreading through town. Ridgeview was in serious financial trouble. Their biggest investor had pulled out, and several projects had been halted. Workers weren't getting paid on time. The company was holding on by a thread. The man didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He just kept watching, waiting, and gathering information quietly. He didn't tell anyone his plan, not even his lawyer. He wanted to be sure before he made any move. Then one morning, while reading the local paper, he saw the headline that changed everything: Ridgeview Construction Files for Bankruptcy. He read the article twice, making sure he wasn't mistaken. The company that had once tried to take his land was now being sold off in pieces: equipment, buildings, and even the company name. Everything was up for auction. He sat back in his chair and took a deep breath. For months, he had felt like the smallest person in the fight. But now, suddenly, the game had changed. He reached for the phone and called the lawyer. "I need your help," he said. "Not for the court case. For something else." The lawyer sounded confused. "What do you mean?" "I want to know how to buy a bankrupt company," he said calmly. There was silence on the other end of the line. "You mean Ridgeview?" "Yes," he replied. "If they tried to take my land through business, then I'll take back everything through business too." For the first time in months, his voice carried not anger, but confidence. He didn't know exactly how he would do it yet. He wasn't a businessman and he didn't have much money, but he had something stronger: patience, determination, and the truth. As the sun went down that evening, he walked to the edge of his field. The bulldozers were gone now, the machines silent. He looked over the land that had caused so much pain, and for the first time he smiled. Maybe, just maybe, this fight wasn't about losing anymore. Maybe it was about winning, in a way no one saw coming. When the man read the news about Ridgeview's bankruptcy, it didn't feel real at first. For months, the company had seemed untouchable: powerful people in expensive suits, big trucks, and endless confidence. But now they were falling apart. It was strange how fast things can change. He folded the newspaper carefully and placed it on the table. The morning light fell across the headline, and for a long time he just stared at it in silence. It wasn't joy he felt, not exactly. It was something deeper, a quiet sense that justice was slowly turning in his favor. Still, the idea of buying Ridgeview seemed almost impossible. He wasn't rich, and he had never owned more than his land. But the thought wouldn't leave his mind. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If they had used business to take what wasn't theirs, then maybe business was the way to get it back. The first step was to understand how things worked. He met with his lawyer again, this time not to talk about the court case, but about the auction. The lawyer explained that when companies go bankrupt, their assets, buildings, machines, vehicles, even the company name, are sold to pay off debts. Anyone can bid if they have the money, the lawyer said. But these sales move fast, and most buyers are big investors. The man nodded slowly. Then I'll just have to think like one. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He didn't have enough savings, and he wasn't experienced in business. But he did have something valuable, a reputation for honesty. People in town respected him because he never lied, never took shortcuts, and always helped others when they needed it. Maybe that could count for something. Over the next few weeks, he began talking quietly to people he trusted. Old workers from Ridgeview who had lost their jobs, small business owners who had been hurt by the company's greed, and a few friends who still believed in fairness. At first, they were surprised when he told them his plan. Some even laughed gently, thinking he was joking. "You? Buying Ridgeview?" one of them said with a grin. He just smiled back. "Why not?" "They took my piece. Maybe it's time I take back more than they expected." One by one, people began to listen seriously. Many of them had been treated unfairly by Ridgeview, too. The company had left unpaid bills, broken promises, and bitter memories. They were tired of watching powerful people get away with things. Slowly, a small group formed, not rich investors, but hardworking people who wanted to see a change. Together, they decided to pool their resources. It wasn't much, but with everyone contributing something, it became a decent starting point. The lawyer helped them set up a small holding company, something legal and official with the man as the leading partner. They gave it a simple name, one that meant renewal and fairness. In the evenings, the man would sit by his kitchen window, going over numbers and papers with a pen and notebook. It was strange doing this kind of work after years of farming, but it also felt right. Every figure he wrote down, every plan he made, was another step toward reclaiming what was his. The day of the auction finally came. It was held in a small conference room in the city. The man wore his cleanest shirt and carried a worn leather folder with his documents. The room was filled with business people, confident voices, expensive watches, and polished shoes. He felt out of place among them, but he didn't let it show. When the auction started, he sat quietly, watching how things moved. One by one, items were sold: trucks, equipment, office furniture. Then the big one came up: the company's remaining assets, including its name and contracts. The bidding began fast. Several groups competed fiercely, but one by one they dropped out as the numbers climbed. The man waited patiently. When the price began to slow, he raised his hand. The auctioneer called out his bid, and heads turned. People looked at him, some whispering. He could feel their surprise in this simple man sitting among them, bidding on a company that once tried to crush him. The bidding went back and forth, but slowly, others began to back away. Maybe they saw no value in a failing company. Maybe they underestimated him. Either way, when the final gavel came down, the auctioneer smiled and said, "Sold." For a moment, the man just sat there, silent. Then it hit him: he had done it. Ridgeview Construction now belonged to him. When he walked out of that building, the city noise seemed distant. He stood on the sidewalk, feeling the cool wind against his face. For months, he had been fighting to keep his land. Now he owned the company that had tried to steal it. The news spread quickly through town. Some people couldn't believe it. Others called it poetic justice. Workers who had lost their jobs began reaching out, asking if he would rebuild the company. He told them yes, but not the old way. He returned to the company's main yard a few days later. The gates were rusty, the equipment worn down, and the offices empty. It looked nothing like the powerful image Ridgeview once showed. But to him, it was a new beginning. He gathered the small group of people who had helped him and said, "We're not here to destroy anything. We're here to build it right this time." Instead of chasing big profits, they focused on smaller projects that mattered, fixing old buildings, helping local farmers, and supporting honest workers. The company slowly came back to life, but with a new spirit. People began to trust it again, not because of big promises, but because of how they were treated. One afternoon, he drove back to his field, the place where it had all started. The sun was setting and the land looked peaceful again. The machines were gone, the noise had faded, and the ground had started to heal. He stood there quietly, remembering every moment and the fear, the anger, the sleepless nights. Now all of that had led to this moment. He owned not just his land, but the very business that once tried to bury him under concrete. It felt almost unreal, but he didn't feel like gloating or seeking revenge. Instead, he felt grateful. Grateful for the people who believed in him, for the patience that kept him going, and for the quiet strength that comes when you refuse to give up. That night, as he sat on his porch, he looked up at the stars and thought about how life can turn around when you stand your ground. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity, the kind that no one can buy or steal. He smiled to himself, knowing the story wasn't over yet. There was still more to do, more to fix, and more people to help. But for now, the land was safe, the company was his, and peace had finally returned. He had won, not through power or anger, but through patience and quiet courage. And that victory would always mean more than anything else. The mornings on his land had started to feel peaceful again. The soft light stretched over the green fields, and the sound of birds replaced the roar of heavy machines that once filled the air. The man would stand at the edge of the field every day, breathing in the quiet. It felt like life had given him back everything he'd lost. Only this time it was stronger, calmer, and built on truth. Running the company was not easy. He quickly realized that rebuilding a broken name took more than money or skill. It needed trust, and trust couldn't be bought. It had to be earned, one promise at a time. The first few months were tough. Some clients were doubtful, some workers were unsure, and many people still remembered Ridgeview as the company that had bullied small landowners. The man didn't try to erase that past. Instead, he faced it openly. When people asked him why he bought the company, he told them the truth, that he wanted to make things right. He started by rehiring old workers who had lost their jobs when Ridgeview collapsed. Many of them had families and had been struggling to find steady work. They were surprised when he called them back, not to blame them for what happened before, but to give them another chance. "We'll build things differently this time," he told them. "No cutting corners, no greed. Just honest work and fair pay." Those words meant something to the workers. Slowly, the atmosphere in the company began to change. The men and women who once worked under harsh orders now worked with pride. They started treating each other like family instead of competitors. The company began taking on small projects, repairing old schools, rebuilding barns, fixing homes after storms. The profits weren't huge, but the satisfaction was. Each project brought more respect from the community, and soon people stopped associating Ridgeview with corruption. Instead, they began to see it as a symbol of second chances. One afternoon, the man received a call from the mayor's office. The town needed help restoring an old community center that had been abandoned for years. It was a big job, the kind of project that could bring attention and stability to the company. He agreed, but only on one condition, that local workers be hired first. The mayor smiled at his request and said, "That's why we called you." The project turned out to be special. Every day, people from the town came by to watch the progress. Some brought food for the workers, others offered materials or a helping hand. It became more than a job. It was a shared mission to bring something back to life. When the building was finally finished, there was a small ceremony. Children ran around laughing, elders sat under the newly painted porch, and the air was filled with music and laughter. The man stood quietly at the edge, looking at what they had built together. It wasn't just bricks and wood, it was hope. As he looked around, he noticed an older woman from the crowd walking toward him. She had tears in her eyes and said, "My husband worked for Ridgeview years ago. He used to come home angry every day because of how they treated people. If he could see this now, he'd be proud. You changed what that name means." Those words stayed with him. They reminded him that winning wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about doing something meaningful that others could feel proud of, too. Months turned into a year, and the company continued to grow. New workers joined, and old ones stayed loyal. The man spent most of his time visiting job sites, talking to workers, and making sure everyone was treated fairly. He never sat in a fancy office or wore a suit. He preferred dusty boots and rolled-up sleeves. That's how people knew he was one of them. Despite all the success, he never forgot where it started, the field where Ridgeview had once tried to build without his permission. He still visited that spot often. Sometimes he'd sit on a wooden bench near the edge of the land and watch the sunset. It reminded him how far things had come. One evening, as he sat there, his lawyer joined him. They had become close friends through everything. The lawyer smiled and said, "You know, when you first told me you wanted to buy Ridgeview, I thought you were out of your mind." The man laughed softly. "I thought so too. But sometimes you've got to do something crazy to make things right." The lawyer nodded. "Well, you didn't just make it right. You changed it for everyone." The man looked out across the field and said, "I just wanted to prove that good people don't always have to lose." Not long after, the company was featured in a local newspaper. The headline read, "The Man Who Turned a Broken Company into a Beacon of Honesty." It told his story simply, not about a man seeking revenge, but about someone who refused to give up on fairness. People from nearby towns started calling for advice, asking how they could run their own businesses with the same values. He never thought of himself as a hero. He was just someone who stood his ground and didn't let greed win. That was enough for him. Years later, the company continued to thrive. It stayed small compared to big corporations, but it had something far greater: respect. The workers were happy, the clients were loyal, and the community trusted them. One morning, the man walked through the office yard watching his team laughing and working together. The same yard that had once been cold and silent now felt alive again. He smiled quietly, knowing that this was what victory really looked like. Not the fall of others, but the rise of something better. As he got into his old pickup truck to drive home, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the Ridgeview sign standing tall, freshly painted and shining under the morning sun. It no longer represented greed or corruption. It represented hard work, honesty, and second chances. When he reached home, he sat on his porch sipping tea while watching the wind move across his field. Life had come full circle. The land that once caused him pain had become a symbol of peace. The company that once tried to crush him now carried his name and his values forward. He realized then that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with anger or power, but with patience, truth, and heart. He leaned back in his chair, smiled at the sky, and whispered softly, "We did it." There was no applause, no cameras, no crowd, just the quiet sound of the wind and the peace he had fought so long to find. But in that moment he knew this was the ending he had always been working toward, and it was perfect.